Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada. Jaya Gurudeva, Jaya Gurudeva, Gurudeva, Shiva Jayam Vishnupad Paramahansa Pariprajakacharya Stotra Sutta Sri Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. ISKCON founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahansa Pariprajakacharya Stotra Sutta Sri Srimad Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Se Kaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Adi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Tulsi Devi Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Samveta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. So we welcome you all on this most auspicious occasion of Sri Rama Ekadasi, which has special significance for us, followers of Srila Prabhupada, because on this date, in 1974, Srila Prabhupada completed his translation of Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta in Juhu, Bombay. My usual practice when Srila Prabhupada was in Bombay was to go to his quarters at the back of Hare Krishna land to accompany him on his morning walk on Juhu Beach. So, and Srila Prabhupada's quarters at the back, on the one side were his quarters, and on the other side, just adjoining, were his staff's quarters. So, as usual, I climbed up the stairs, but this time, quite unusually, both the doors were locked. The door to Srila Prabhupada's quarters and the door to his staff's quarters. So I knocked on both doors and no one answered. I knocked again. And eventually, Srila Prabhupada's secretary at the time, Harikesh Prabhu, opened the door to the staff's quarters. And he said that Srila Prabhupada had been up all night translating Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta, that he had completed his translation, and that at the end he had dictated the most beautiful glorification of his spiritual master. And Harikesh Prabhu added that Srila Prabhupada was in a very jubilant mood, and he said that we should celebrate by having a feast. Now, you know, in the Vedic calendar, Vaishnava calendar, the new day begins with sunrise. So, although Srila Prabhupada completed the translation before sunrise on the Rama Ekadasi, when we went upstairs, which was, would have been the Dvadasi, our case said we should have a feast. Now, I will read from Srila Prabhupada's concluding words. Today, Sunday, November 10th, 1974, corresponding to the 10th of Kartik, Chaitanya era 488, the 11th day of the dark fortnight, the Rama Ekadasi, we have now finished the English translation of Sri Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami's Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta in accordance with the authorized order of His Divine Grace, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Goswami Maharaj, my beloved eternal spiritual master, guide, and friend. Although according to material vision, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, passed away from this world on the last day of December 1936, I still consider His Divine Grace to be always present with me by His Vani, His words. And here Srila Prabhupada is setting the theme for the entire concluding words, which is His spiritual master's presence. There are two ways of association, by Vani and by Vapu. Vani means words, and Vapu means physical presence. Physical presence is sometimes appreciable and sometimes not. But Vani continues to exist eternally. Therefore, we must take advantage of the Vani, not the physical presence. The Bhagavad Gita, for example, is the Vani of Lord Krishna. Although Krishna was personally present 5,000 years ago and is no longer physically present from the materialistic point of view, the Bhagavad Gita continues. In this connection, we may call to memory the time when I was fortunate enough to meet His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, sometime in the year 1922. Srila Prabhupada had come to Calcutta from Sridham Mayapur to start the missionary activities of the Gaudiya Math. He was sitting in a house at Altadanga when through the inducement of an intimate friend, the late Sriman Narendranath Balak, I had the opportunity to meet His Divine Grace for the first time. So Srila Prabhupada was the leader of his friends. And his friend, Narendranath Malik, a dear friend, wanted Srila Prabhupada, who at the time was called Abai, he wanted Abai to meet Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur to approve of him or disapprove of him. So they wanted Srila Prabhupada's verdict about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So he was sitting in a house at Ultadanga when, through the inducement of an intimate friend, the late Sriman Narendranath Malik, I had the opportunity to meet His Divine Grace for the first time. I do not remember the actual date of the meeting, but at that time I was one of the managers of Dr. Bose's laboratory in Calcutta. I was a newly married young man, addicted to Gandhi's movement, and dressed in khadi. Fortunately, even at our first meeting, His Divine Grace advised me to preach the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in English in the Western countries. Because at that time I was a complete nationalist, a follower of Mahatma Gandhi's, I submitted to His Divine Grace that unless our country were freed from foreign subjugation, no one would hear the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu seriously. Of course, we had some argument on this subject, but at last I was defeated and convinced that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message is the only panacea for suffering humanity. Panacea means the cure for everything. And Srila Prabhupada relates that up until that point, he had never been defeated in an argument. But here he was defeated by his Guru Maharaj, and as Srila Prabhupada commented, he was happy that he was defeated. Of course, we had some argument on this subject, but at last I was defeated and convinced that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message is the only panacea for suffering humanity. I was also convinced that the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was then in the hands of a very expert devotee, and that surely the message of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would spread all over the world. I could not, however, immediately take up his instructions to preach, but I took his words very seriously and was always thinking of how to execute his order, although I was quite unfit to do so. So here Srila Prabhupada enunciates a very important principle of devotional service, which is that if we receive an instruction from the spiritual master, but are due to circumstances unable to execute the order, we should keep the instruction within our heart and always think of when we can get the opportunity to execute the order. I had my own experience with that principle with Srila Prabhupada. In India, Srila Prabhupada had instructed me to write. He said that I should take up writing as my first business. So in those days, we didn't have computers, and in India, even typewriters were very rare. So I bought some pens and paper to follow Srila Prabhupada's instruction that I should write. But soon thereafter, we received a telegram saying that we should come to Bombay because Srila Prabhupada was organizing the first big Bombay Pandal program. So I went to Bombay, and Shamsundar Prabhu was the temple president. And so he wanted me to collect ads to be published in a souvenir magazine to be released on the occasion of the Pandal to raise funds. So I told him that Srila Prabhupada had instructed me to write. And Shamsundar Prabhu replied that you can do that anytime, but this is one opportunity we have. We can walk into any businessman's office and ask him to give an advertisement for our souvenir. And it will be very easy for them to give from their businesses. The advertisement would be taken as a tax deduction. So I should collect for the Pandal program, and then I could take up writing. So what he said made sense, and Srila Prabhupada wanted us to cooperate with our authorities. So I agreed. Then, a little before the Pandal program was scheduled to begin, Srila Prabhupada arrived in Bombay. At that time, we were staying in the Akash Ganga building on Warden Road. Our apartment was overlooking the ocean. And as usual, when Srila Prabhupada arrived, he went into his room and all the devotees followed, and he glanced lovingly at all of the disciples and, reciprocated with them in little ways. And then he asked me, "So, Giriraj, how is your writing going?" I was flustered. I didn't know what to say. And Srila Prabhupada appreciated my mental condition. So he said, "All right, we will discuss later." So shortly thereafter, after all the devotees had left the room, Srila Prabhupada called me back. And again, he asked, "So, what about your writing?" And I told him what Shamsundar Prabhu had said, that, this is one opportunity we have to walk into any man's office and ask for an advertisement. And I added that I knew that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to cooperate with our authorities. And so that's what I had done. But still, I was nervous. I was anxious. I didn't know what Srila Prabhupada would think of my answer. And Srila Prabhupada replied, "Yes, you can suspend the order of the spiritual master, but you can never neglect it." And he said, "Just like me, my spiritual master instructed me to write, but I've been so busy traveling and preaching in India that I also have hardly had any time to write. But when the circumstances allow, then I will take up the writing. And similarly with you. I was very relieved how understanding and practical Srila Prabhupada was. So, so now we come back to the concluding words. Srila Prabhupada says, I could not, however, immediately take up his instructions to preach, but I took his words very seriously and was always thinking of how to execute his order, although I was quite unfit to do so. In this way, I passed my life as a householder until 1950, when I retired from family life as a vanaprastha. With no companion, I loitered here and there until 1958, when I took sannyas. Then I was completely ready to discharge the order of my spiritual master. Previously, in 1936, just before His Divine Grace passed away at Jagannath Puri, I wrote him a letter asking what I could do to serve him. In reply, he wrote me a letter dated 13th December 1936, ordering me in the same way to preach in English the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as I had heard it from him. After he passed away, I started the fortnightly magazine Back to Godhead sometime in 1944 and tried to spread the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through the magazine. After I took sannyas, a well-wishing friend suggested that I write books instead of magazines. Magazines, he said, might be thrown away, but books remain perpetually. Now here's another important point, that Srila Prabhupada was ready to accept suggestions from well-wishing friends, as long as the suggestions were in keeping with the instructions of his spiritual master. And there was a similar instance in Bombay. Srila Prabhupada had a well-wishing friend named Bridratan Mohta. He was a life member and a supporter. And Mr. Mohta had suggested that Srila Prabhupada serialize the Bhagavad Gita in Back to Godhead magazine. And Srila Prabhupada accepted the suggestion, although he adjusted it and made it Srimad Bhagavatam that was serialized in Back to Godhead rather than the Bhagavad Gita. So we should be prepared to accept a good advice from well-wishing friends, which advice furthers our service to our spiritual master. After he passed away, I started the fortnightly magazine Back to Godhead sometime in 1944. and tried to spread the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through this magazine. After I took sannyas, a well-wishing friend suggested that I write books instead of magazines. Magazines, he said, might be thrown away, but books remain perpetually. Then I attempted to write Srimad Bhagavatam. Before that, when I was a householder, I had written on Srimad Bhagavad Gita and had completed about 1,100 pages, but somehow or other the manuscript was stolen. So that's a lot to have 1,100 pages of work stolen. But Srila Prabhupada persevered in his service to his spiritual master and in his mission to save the fallen conditioned souls. I had written on Srimad Bhagavad Gita and had completed about 1,100 pages, but somehow or other the manuscript was stolen. In any case, when I had published Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, in 3 volumes in India, I thought of going to the USA. By the mercy of His divine grace, I was able to come to New York on September 17th, 1965. Since then, I have translated many books, including Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, a summary, and many others. In the meantime, I was induced to translate Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta and publish it in an elaborate version. In his leisure time in later life, His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would simply read Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta. It was his favorite book. He used to say that there would be a time when foreigners would learn the Bengali language to read the Caitanya-caritamṛta. The work on this translation began about 18 months ago. Now, by the grace of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, it is finished. In this connection, I have to thank my American disciples, especially Sriman Pradumya Das Adhikari, Sriman Nitai Das Adhikari, Sriman Jayadwaita Das Brahmachari, and many other boys and girls who are sincerely helping me in writing, editing, and publishing all these literatures. So Srila Prabhupada has been giving the credit to his Guru Maharaj, you could say passing the credit upwards, and now he's giving credit to his disciples who are helping him, and you could say passing the credit down to them. But he's not taking the credit for himself at any stage. Now, in the next paragraph, Srila Prabhupada makes a very revolutionary statement, or very illuminating statement. I think that His Divine Grace, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, is always seeing my activities and guiding me within my heart by His words. As it is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam, Tene Brahma Hridaya Adhikavaye, Bhagavatam 1:1:1. So that we can all understand that we receive an instruction from the spiritual master, and that instruction is in our heart and it inspires us. But here Srila Prabhupada says something more. Spiritual inspiration comes from within the heart, wherein the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in his Paramatma feature, is always sitting with all his devotees and associates. So, yes, Srila Prabhupada got inspiration from the super soul within the heart, but the super soul within the heart is not alone. He's accompanied by all his devotees, including, in this case, we can say Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So, in a very personal way, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was guiding Srila Prabhupada in his work of translation from within the heart, where Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was sitting along with the Paramatma. It is to be admitted that whatever translation work I have done is through the inspiration of my spiritual master. Because personally, I am most insignificant and incompetent to do this materially impossible work. I do not think myself a very learned scholar, but I have full faith in the service of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. If there is any credit to my activities of translating, it is all due to His Divine Grace. And it is said that when the spiritual master gives order, he gives the potency to execute the order. So here Srila Prabhupada is saying, I do not think myself a very learned scholar, but I have full faith in the service of my spiritual master, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. If there is any credit to my activities of translating, it is all due to His Divine Grace. Certainly, if His Divine Grace were physically present at this time, I don't know what that ringing is, but anyway. Certainly, if His Divine Grace were physically present at this time, it would have been a great occasion for jubilation. But even though He is not physically present, I am confident that He is very much pleased by this work of translation. So, yeah, even though He's not physically present, He's spiritually present. And He's pleased. Srila Prabhupada is confident that He's pleased by this work of translation. And I have no doubt that His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, was immensely pleased with Srila Prabhupada for his translation and for everything else Srila Prabhupada did in his service. He was very fond of seeing many books published to spread the Krishna consciousness movement. Therefore, our society, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, has been formed to execute the order of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and His Divine Grace, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So basically, Srila Prabhupada is saying that ISKCON is meant to execute the order of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in the matter of publishing and distributing books to spread Krishna consciousness. It is my wish that devotees of Lord Chaitanya all over the world enjoy this translation. In other words, Srila Prabhupada wanted us to read his books. As he once said, of his disciples, distributing my books will keep them happy, but reading my books will keep them, meaning keep them in Krishna consciousness. And yes, we should make all the efforts that Srila Prabhupada put into writing his books fruitful by ourselves reading the books, studying the books, and applying what we read in our lives. It is my wish that devotees of Lord Chaitanya all over the world enjoy this translation. And I am glad to express my gratitude to the learned men in the Western countries who are so pleased with my work that they are ordering in advance all my books that will be published in the future. Yes, Srila Prabhupada had disciples who went to universities and got standing orders for Srila Prabhupada's books. In other words, orders not only for the books that were published, but for the books that would be published in the future. And His Holiness Bhakti-tirtha Swami Maharaj was a leader in that effort. On this occasion, therefore, I request my disciples who are determined to help me. And here I may say that we all count as Srila Prabhupada's disciples. Some may be Diksha disciples, but certainly we are all Shiksha disciples. On this occasion, therefore, I request my disciples who are determined to help me in this work to continue their cooperation fully, so that philosophers, scholars, religionists, and people in general all over the world will benefit by reading our transcendental literatures, such as Srimad Bhagavatam and Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta. So this is how we can please Srila Prabhupada, one of the important ways by which we can please Srila Prabhupada. And then he concludes, thus end the Bhaktivedanta purports to Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta, dated November 10th, 1974, at the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, Hare Krishna Land, Juhu, Bombay. Jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Sri Caitanya-caritamṛta ki jai. Shri Rama Ekadasi ki jai.